Dear students, in the first week of the course on Sociology of India, paper 1, we have seen the colonial discourse where the conceptualization of India as a subject and object is articulated. The views of travelers, Orientalists, missionaries and British administrators were discussed. These interpretations helped the Britishers understand the country's social structure, thus extending their economic purview to the political administration. When political power was established in India, it turned into a colony and came under the regime of British Raj under colonial rule. The nature of the political administration in the country during that period did not create a strong resentment from the Indians against the colonial rule as an initial response. This second unit of this course is to discuss the nationalist discourse. In this first module of the second unit, we will be discussing what is discourse, what kind of discourse is specific to Indian society, then colonial power and the initial response of the Indians. Now we can see what is discourse. The term discourse can be etymologically traced to the Latin word discourse, which denotes a conversation or a speech. Discourse can be defined as language in use, language used to do something and mean something, language produced and interpreted in real world context. Discourse can be a unit of expression in the verbal and written mode. It can simply be seen as language in use. By language in use, we can set a norm, preferences and expectations which relate language to context. Guy Cook describes discourse as language in use or language used to communicate something felt to be coherent, which may be or may not be correspond to a correct sentence or series of correct sentences. Using words, thinking, valuing, acting and engaging in the right situations at right times with the correct objects are all part of the discourse. The scope of this understanding of discourse goes much beyond the phrase and even the context of the speech act, speech occurrence and speech situations. It makes clear that our ability to communicate effectively or how to use language in daily life is a crucial component and an integral part of our culture. Now we can see what is discourse and we can see it through the eyes of Sudeep Kaviraj. Let us now discuss discourse in the Indian context as a response to colonialism. Sudeep Kaviraj highlighted the structural aspect of the nationalist discourse when examining it. We now can discuss the kind of discourse done by him. He examined that discourse does not mean all that people in the actual political world say. That is, the mere totality of words, ideas, concepts and more complex combinations of this like speech, dispositions, programs, ideologies and official documents, because all of this did not have some distinguishable internal order. A totality that is as pointless as it is incomparable. Studies of discourse can turn to two different traditions of rigorous thinking about these questions. The structuralism of various types is the first tradition. This practice begins with structural linguistics, which governs our capacity to engage in episodic speech through grammar typically unavailable to common thought. It is characterized by its effervescence, contingency, fast, dramatic life and death, and deeper underlying organizing structures. The norms create a latent structure, restricting, inaccessible to language users in general and as a result recoverable through deliberate research procedures. According to Foucault, such grammars are present in theoretical and natural languages. He also considered that language would identify profound structural networks of silence unutterability and other forms of exclusion forming the crucial boundary between what can be stated inside a discourse and what cannot be. In this tradition, the construction and understanding of the meaning in the language will be dealt. The second tradition is that the study of discourse represents an object with just the opposite characteristics. Valentin Volosninov was one of those in the post-revolutionary Russia who developed a specifically Marxist conception of consciousness. It was significant that he did so starting from an interest in the philosophy of language. For him, the structure can never fully explain or clarify why what is said is said. His primary focus was on figuring out how classical lines are regularly twisted in diverse directions and how social life's erratic but persistent needs change them through time. Volosinov's theories have crucial importance for understanding human consciousness because they deal with two of psychological central questions: the relationship between individual and the society and the relationship between thought and language. In this sense, the structure cannot explain the history, and hence discourse study must try to capture precisely the eruption of linguistic phenomenon, the individuality of living experience, expressions of experience, or poetically the breath of life. Discourse is used in political analysis to refer to a collection of ideas that have a particular internal coherence due to their linguistic content and their external associations with political events and to be grouped chronologically. The coherence imparted to ideas can be internal and external. Internal in the sense of conceptual meaning or use meanings, and external in terms of their act meanings. It is simple dichotomy between a correct and a false consciousness. Volosninov distinct between theme and meaning must move in that direction. Use meanings and act meanings have to go hand in hand in the historical analysis, which has to be the purpose of the theory of ideology. Now we can see the discourse that is specific to Indian nationalism. Intellectual history has two analytical styles of contextualism according to Kaviraj. The first one is the Cambridge school, which focuses on studying theoretical or intellectual works to determine their accurate historical interpretations by regaining the author's intentions is the first type. Concepts acquire specific common meanings as a result of their circulation within a larger political discourse. The second one is the analytical style, which is followed in German intellectual history, which adapts a different approach and focuses more on the actual applications of specific concepts essential to the efficient operation of contemporary social activities. Hence, historical knowledge can be theoretical or narrative. History presents not only curiosity about society's past and signified much more interest in the structure and implications of the techniques of constructing these highly political narratives. Sudipta Kaviraj suggested that combining both approaches in the Indian case might be fruitful. Indian knowledge for the British perspective is commonly considered to be hindered the path to the chosen past. Thus, history assumed a highly political role, the nodal point, the boundary, and the result of nationalist and imperialist ideologies, intellectual rivalry. In the analysis of nationalist discourse, history is seen as a peculiarly empowering discourse, as the written history of India was not collectively engaged in presenting the past, but still somewhere in the future. The political imagination during the colonial era created the knowledge of India as an object by presenting the historical past. Nationalist ideas establish both plausible and misleading narratives where historical representation tries to bring in political control, which can be an approach to search for simple versions of false consciousness. In several distinct stages, Indian nationalist narratives emerged for the initial classes with colonist ideology and self-bear a powerful historical impact on the early growth of nationalist politics. Then the Gandhian phase of Indian nationalism was restructured and finally the ideology of new nation state emerged after Indian independence. Now we can see the process of reformation of nationalist narrative. The ideological discourse of nationalism is both the configuration of false and plausible beliefs. There is a significant relationship between history and narrative in the backdrop of ideology formations. This enables people to make sense of the complexities of the modern world. Self-portrayal and rendering of their own history were the influencing power of modern ideologies. Nevertheless, the history of India, specifically during the colonial era, was a complex combination of the factual and the imaginary. It is more frequent to take for granted the history that the nationalism has historically made familiar only to challenge its ideological assessment at several vital points. In the history of the nationalist movement, the Gandhi-Irvin Pact of 1931 was considered to be crucial. However, it could have been viewed as a sellout to the imperialism rather than an astute step of temporary retreat. Even the narrative story of Congress, as moderates and extremists, looked at it as factions but not moderates as social progressivists. To better understand nationalism surpassing internal descriptions, one must have to look for things like other regularities, structures and resemblances which have not found in significant place in this history. As an initial response to colonialism, we can discuss the historic preconditions inclusive of the relatively neglected cultural processes. Now we can see the initial response of the Indians towards the colonialism. While trying to understand the Indians' response to the colonial power, we can perceive a reply without solid dislike. This may be because of several reasons and we can just try to find out few of it. The traditional governing classes of India, the Nawabs and Rajas and their power struggles gave a distinct dimension to colonialism, where they viewed them as fictitious foes and could not comprehend the British conquest of their continent. The lower class of society typically kept a distance from the unrest at the highest levels of political power. They were unconcerned with the rise and fall of their lords' fortunes. The intermediary group positively responded to the European arrival with the advancement in the various fields. The blending of moral and material interests captivated these groups. The earliest reaction of the advent of the Europeans into India was political and cultural. Exploitation based on the economy was hardly addressed, whereas there was more concern for cultural meanings in the backdrop of Europe. Europe underwent rapid change in its economy, politics and culture during this period. With its inspiring power and attractive modernity, it approached Indians differently in terms of time and space. Indians, regarding their history, were relatively lacking information and were clueless about the culture and politics. Indians' colonial history was essential in introducing the concept of modern liberty to the country. Kaviraj recognized three distinct paths that have an impact on modern notions of liberty. They were legal arrangements of property, second one is institutional influence, particularly new educational culture, the spread of modern Western education, and the third one is the intellectual influence of Western social thinking, which was the byproduct of Western style education. Indian history was presented as a complicated synthesis of the real and the imagined by Western education. The lack of information among Indians, the powerful rationalist narratives of the Europeans and the encounters of Indian intellectuals with the mythical narrative through Western education created a different understanding. The nationalism of India emerged as a dissenting trend against foreign rulers. In the discourse of nationalism in India, the European version of history was utilized to polarize significantly. British policies helped in the emergence of Indian nationalism. The British government's direct or indirect interventions and the trends that disputed modernity itself is despairingly, especially Romanticism, idealism and later socialism, found their way straight and efficiently into the nationalists' heart. Colonialism in India was initiated in the latent manner, where the success of the Britishers was not brought to the limelight till they took a solid political hold. The colonial rule was interested in the economic system and was deeply entwined with various cultural processes. Through a slow but irreversible process, it became an apparatus that established an extensive civilizing process. The process involves altering, restructuring and conquering the difficult terrain of all, that is, the culture of Indian society in the realm of the mind. Deshkar Kada was one of the essential books that is being written by Deshkar wrote, which was based on the comprehensive understanding of the colonial impact on the Indian economy. It was written at the time when the nationalist movement in India was entering a new phase. British administrators administering India as a colony followed a model where their administrative inclinations initially addressed the similarity and then moved towards perception of difference. The impact of this strategy remains an imperfect and unconcluded process. As a part of this strategy, reforms were taken up in the Indian society where the Reformation initiatives of British rulers reflected the bourgeois Europe. European society was highly integrated with the common core of moral, cognitive and social beliefs, constituting a social common sense that mirrored the success of bourgeois revolutions. This knowledge of beliefs reflected the structure of the society, which helped in the social actions with internal consistency and effectiveness in the real world. Intelligentsia, through social theory, articulated and re-coordinated core beliefs as dependent on historical needs. However, this was not pertinent to traditional Indian society because of its cultural organization and characteristic features. The colonial policy makers assumed that and put into practice their ideology that changing people's common sense beliefs would gradually influence the change in the core common sense of the entire society. This is also known as Gramscian strategy. The cultural strategy of colonialism resulted in success and failure. The colonial process created a new Indian elite. As per the expectation of the colonial policy makers, these intellectual elites should have accomplished the functions of creators, shapers, repositories and communicators. The colonial educational process did not produce the expected outcome. The cultural transformation of the new intellectual elite of India was drastic and complete, which was more historical a priori in terms of their thinking about society and history. The new elite developed a desire for Western history, affluence, technological dominance and political clout due to the new way of thinking. The British's capacity to persuade the rest of Indian society lessened in proportion to how well they influenced the new elite. Britishers' strategy of imparting colonialism as an altruistic institution in spreading enlightenment did not work out as expected. This created the rest of Indian society mobilizing with a shared language, common presuppositions, theories, prejudice and inclinations. The history of resistance to British rule instantly exhibits the effect of this move on cultural India. The 1857 revolt created a bond between traditional elites and the rebellious peasants. The grievances against British rule continued, leading to the formation of Congress and the resentfulness of the subaltern classes. The political divide between colonialism and the Indian nation was created by nationalism. It is essential to understand Gandhi's discourse and his discursive position here. So far, there was a gulf between the lower order and the elite, and Gandhi managed to bridge through with his kind of discourse to keep the values, objectives, and conceptions of the world of two sides intelligibly to each other. In that way, Gandhi's role in Indian nationalism is crucial. Now we can see the opinions of the various historians and political scientists regarding the rise of Indian nationalism. British policymakers introduced English education to bring change to the entire Indian society. Indians, after receiving their education, understood modern ideas of freedom and equality by traveling to different parts of the world. These initiated movements within society, especially reform activities. Partha Chatterjee is of the view that Indian nationalism was an output of Western educated leadership. Ashish Nandi also viewed Indian nationalism emerged because of Western imperialism. Bele believes that Indian nationalism is built on the pre-existing sense of territoriality. According to Bandyopadhyaya, the awareness of nationalism was based on hostility towards British rule, a feeling of patriotism and a sense of pride in ancient Indian tradition, whereas Valentine Chirol believes that the politicalization of Indian society based on linguistic regions, castes and religious communities was responsible for the rise of Indian nationalism rather than modern categories of class or nation. The emergence of modern Indian nationalism was against the challenges created by foreign rulers. British policies helped in the emergence of Indian nationalism. To summarize, in this model, we started by understanding that discourse is what it defines. It shows us the power of language and communication. Sudipta Kaviraj has given us an account of what discourse is in the Indian context. There is a distinction between the mere totality of the words spoken and the derivation of meaning from the concepts delivered through language. By emphasizing this difference in the context of discourse, Kaviraj has given us ample opportunity to study India's response to colonialism. The Britishers framed the colonial policies to have a hold on the Indian social structure, which actually helped in the emergence of nationalism in India. The political and the cultural frameworks of colonialism and multinational settings together inevitably lead to the emergence of Indian nationalism with the support of the new intellectual elite. Nationalism is an important ideology to understand the dynamics of Indian society. This module covered the context in which Indian nationalism arose and how India first responded to colonialism. In the next module, we will study the conscious construction through anti-colonialism which led to the emergence of Indian nationalism. Thank you.